talk about using acceptance test-driven development to build customers that care. That means customers that actually give a shite about what's going on, that want to be involved, that make a difference. So we're pretty excited about that. This is us. Those are our virtual business cards. We all work for the same company. We're on the same project, but we have very different roles: analyst, tester, developer. And we're hoping that through this experience report, you can learn some things about how we were able to put this into practice, some of the lessons we learned, some real-world examples, and then some takeaways that we were able to capture. Now, our domain was gas pipes, natural gas pipes. Maybe you've heard some of the controversy over the last few years of trying to get the Keystone pipeline. This is not a simple website. This is not, hey, I want to sell a couple ebooks, or I want to sell a real book online. But there were a significant number of things going on in this. This is a data-driven project with a lot of calculations. What we've been told is that in this nationwide network of pipes that are owned by different people, that connect to each other, that have physical locations where you drop off your natural gas, where you pick it up and you put it in a tanker, that there are no systems that operate more than one pipe at a time. And that if you are a company that's buying a second pipe or putting in a second pipe, you may duplicate your system. Database, code, all the connections, but there's nothing that can handle all at one time. So we're trying to change the industry here with this project by building a system that can do it all, that can handle multiple pipes, that can handle integration. But it's not a simple set of constraints we're dealing with. The data is pretty heavy. So, for example, there are contracts. The contracts say that I can put on 10,000 decatherms of natural gas in a given location. And I can deliver it over to that guy there. That's what my contract says. But this is a physical pipe. There might be a constraint. Maybe there's maintenance stuff. Maybe the stuff, which I'll let a storm. Yeah, a storm gets in the way. Or we can't deliver all 10,000. The pipe has a certain capacity. That's 30,000, but 25,000 are down for maintenance. So there's constraints here. There's physical locations. It's only good for a certain time. You have to maintain the pressure of all this. So in an effort to manage all of these things together, the capacity and the rest, we're building this. So in an effort to do all that, we are saying, hey, let's build an application. Let's take a greenfield project, use all the knowledge that we have, and go forward. What was nice is toward the beginning of the project, a few of us on there got some training from Goico on specification by example. It was some good training about how to really approach this project with the data. And it was very helpful for us to be able to say, here's some examples. We're already struggling with this. What can we do to make this come alive for our project? One thing that he referenced a lot was domain-driven design.
Yeah, in addition to attending Goico's Spec by Example seminar, we did a pretty simple exercise, which was basically a book club. The team voted on a number of books every couple months. Every iteration or so, we would read a few chapters and someone would present. Our tech lead at the time thought that this book was, essential reading for software engineers. Has anybody already read it or heard of it? Okay, that's a lot of people. Good. We took, like I'm sure many of you have, a lot of good tools from this book that we will talk about. But the main idea here is that this sort of peripheral learning that our team did. This book club thing, it injected new ideas into the team that weren't related specifically to natural gas pipelines, but could be applied to the project in a more general sense. And we were lucky in that this is what we chose because, or one of the things that we chose because it gave us a lot of good tools moving forward.
Yeah, so as these guys have said, the domain already was challenging. It was highly analytical. We were dealing with a lot of math formulas. And also there's a lot of routing algorithms and shortest path algorithms and a lot of business rules that were going back and forth there. On top of it, the challenge here was that we were a distributed team. We had a one set of team in Brazil, so we had one half in Houston down there and the other half in Brazil. and all the BAs and QAs and product or devs had to kind of pair with people in Houston, and also all the product owners that were in Houston. So it was really important for us to just kind of come up with one common language. So when we are talking and pairing with them and speaking these different terms, you know, it has to mean exact same thing. Initially, when we started, it was actually a lot of confusion there, because one thing would mean like a lot of in different contexts, it would mean different things, and we were, you know, confusing ourselves. But eventually, it worked out well.
Has anybody ever heard of the band The Talking Heads? Yes? And they have a particular tune called This Must Be the Place. It's one of the more famous tunes, and what's interesting about it is that for that song, the band actually switched instruments. So they weren't playing their primary instrument, they were playing like a secondary instrument, or, you know, someone else's instrument. And it got to be a pretty famous song, like one of their more famous if you listen to it. And what they talk about is exploring new paths of creativity in switching up things. Our team kind of took a similar approach with roles and expectations for roles. So we all have these titles that kind of RM uses to build up teams, areas of expertise, things like that. So you need 2 QAs, you need a dev, you need a PM, etc. Within the team, we kind of rejected that notion. We kind of referred to everyone as an engineer. So the basic notion was that you just do whatever you need to do for the good of the team with the skills that you have at that moment. And so what did that mean? You saw maybe in the brochure actually, for this particular meeting here today, cross-pollination, like cross-pollination of ideas, like getting a bunch of people into a room that have good ideas and spreading that knowledge, spreading that wealth, etc. We did the same kind of thing within the team. I, as a QA, would be, say, doing a lot of different things throughout the course of the project. Pairing with Lav to implement features, pairing with Jeffrey to analyze stories and to drive out acceptance criteria to make sure stories were testable. Pairing with other QAs to do, I don't know, build and deploy tasks. Just anything that I had the capability to do at that time, to do it, to wear that hat if necessary. And it wasn't just testers doing that, it was every role doing that. So it wasn't uncommon for Jeffrey to be debugging test code or domain code. And it wasn't uncommon for Lav to be doing manual exploratory testing for a feature that, you know, another dev QA pair had written together. Real quick, one of the things that we do on our teams a lot is pair programming, which makes facilitating this approach pretty easy, because you can slide in a person of a different role to sit there and actually pair. And whether or not that person is driving the entire time, or 50% of the time, is one thing. It's often not the case, but it really allows you to bake quality in, which is a phrase that we use a lot. Baking it in at every level, not just as an afterthought where you test after the thing is finished, but having somebody thinking about testing and somebody thinking about each of the roles, areas of expertise throughout the formation of the feature itself. So if you're familiar with domain-driven design, like many of you are, you'll probably know what this slide illustrates, which is the knowledge crunch. So I have a quote, let's see here, from domain-driven design. So effective domain modelers are knowledge crunchers. They take a torrent of information and probe for the relevant trickle. So this is probably an experience all of us have had when starting a new project. You know, there's new terms, new jargon, new people speaking about things in similar but varied ways. Our jobs are to be active participants in that process. What do I mean? Actively trying to find the nuggets of truth that are coming at us in this like big wave of information, especially at the start of a project. Domain-driven design helped us create an approach, a focused approach to this. We had to remain alert for inconsistencies. We had to constantly question anything that was said by product owners or whoever that went against our current understanding of the system.
Product owners weren't used to the Agile theme also. They kind of gave everything, you know, to us up front when we got there, and we had to kind of train them.
They had never worked with, you know, directly with a software development team before. And they wanted to give us all the information at once. They wanted to give us all the information as the system would be like a year and a half down the road, not as the system exists right now. So it's like we're using these concepts that don't even like matter to us. So we had to like get them to focus down. Lav, do you want to talk about the nomination in sort of pipeline management? The nomination is the order. It says how much gas someone ordered, and there's like a kind of a illustrative example of this.
This is like, you know, when we started developing this, you know, there were nomination was everything. You know, whenever they would say any like generic term, it would be like, oh yeah, that's a nomination. But as we sit down with them, we talk to PAs and QAs, and we create our scenarios. We kind of figuring things out that nominations are actually three different things. There was a nomination, there was like a nomination transaction, there was a transaction request. And all of that, stuff, all of those definitions mean different things in different contexts and from different users' perspective. So we have to make sure that, as we are implementing our domain classes and code, they are doing the exact same thing that we, as a user, we speak to each other. So that was like one example where we kind of had to guide them, and get that out of them. It was difficult initially.
Lav mentioned those three things: nomination transaction, transaction request, and nomination. When we first started talking to the product owners, all of them were referring to all three of those separate domain entities as nomination. So it took this questioning to get them to finally see that, okay, these are different things and they mean different things, etc. And so it was with lots of different aspects of the domain, lots of different terms. There was that constant questioning and whittling down to the truth. Basically, what do these words mean? And eventually we would get to a point where each of those words would permeate not only our speech to one another in face-to-face conversations, but through the domain, through the test code, back and forth through Brazil. That whittling down to a useful language, like is discussed in this ubiquitous language notion coming out of domain-driven design, was really important. We had awesome product owners. They were engaged. They wanted to learn about software development. They were in the team room. They were golfers, so we set up we had putters in there, and we wanted to make them feel welcome. These people had probably 60, 70 plus years of experience in the energy industry, but what we quickly realized is that it was all in their heads. Nobody had ever documented their business processes. Nobody had ever really documented how gas moves from point A to point B along a pipe. And so we quickly realized that somebody should write this down, and that's kind of where our tests come in. We even had this, we were talking about this earlier at breakfast, this entity in their old system called the death spiral. And it was like, okay, we heard this term, what is the death spiral? We had no way of reproducing it, but they had seen it happen in the wild, where it was a catastrophic failure of their software that resulted in people not being able to do what they needed to do. The issue was that there was just no documentation of how to reproduce this. And in fact, this particular project had been written off, I think multiple times, with a lot of money being lost. Does anybody want to take
it? It was $10+ million on the last time they had tried to implement this project.
And there were multiple attempts. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what the Achilles heel of the last attempt was?
It's a simple math function. You learned about it in 5th or 6th grade.
Exactly. Rounding. Rounding was the issue. So we're talking about, go ahead.
Okay, so let me jump in here. So everyone knows what rounding is, right? Can I see hands? Okay, so leave your hand up. Everyone, raise your hand up, please. Okay, if you know what baker's rounding is, leave your hand up. Oh, we lost hands. Now, if you know what banker's rounding is, oh, we've only got, 20% of the room or less. So baker's rounding, you always round up. Banker's rounding, you always round down. Bakers are much nicer than bankers. But we were running all three kinds of rounding in the system, and different conditions call for different kinds of rounding. And you quickly ran into a death spiral.
The previous teams didn't document these fundamental concepts. They didn't really know how to reproduce the errors that they were seeing. Basically what you got were fractions of a decatherm of gas compounding over time to create this situation that was major fail case. Nobody could reproduce it, and then you lose, right off $10 million or whatever. Next slide. So what we see here is what we call our humble beginnings. We would have these whiteboard discussions that I know Jeffrey will discuss, but essentially we have these puzzles. We have the team, the POs, the team sitting around talking about scenarios similar to this one, where you got up on a projector, some basic inputs, some variables, etc., and just kind of throwing around topics. Like say I nominate 70,000 decatherms from location A to location B, and the capacity at location B is such and such. How much do we expect to be cut? These type of exercises. One thing we realized is that they were quite engaging to the customer. Jeffrey, you want to take it?
So, we've got our basic Gherkin language here, our give, when, then. And when we first started saying, hey, we're going to try to introduce this concept to the customers, some of the product owners were very glad to tell us over their dead body. They had enough trouble with give, when, then. The whole idea of we're going to give you a specification and we're going to tell you how this works in any more detail, you already understand it. Get out of my face. It was an initial response, one that caused a little bit of trepidation on the team. We put it forward.
Excel sheets worked out for us.
Yeah. So in the end, we got into the Excel spreadsheets. But we would start with saying, okay, given we have some transaction, when the capacity is analyzed and we have to cut the nomination, what's an example of that? And what we would do is we'd sort of put the simple example, the first line here. Then we'd say, okay, what else can happen? And then by documenting these examples, we really got them with whiteboard sessions to get going on. It wasn't too long where we could then move to spreadsheets. From spreadsheets, we would put them in spec flow. So we would use those same examples. We would actually put the names of the different locations, what kind of pipe and connection it was, all the other details you see. They're very exciting if you've never been involved with the gas transport industry. But we would take these scenarios that would start with the whiteboard, we'd then hash them back and forth on a spreadsheet, we'd go back in there. From there, we put them into spec flow. The problem is I'm an analyst, and the product owners were less geeky than I was. I mean, they even asked us how to use some of the features on their phone. Not the most tech culture I've ever seen.
They were like IE6, IE8.
Yeah. So what we did was we installed Pickles for an interface. We put Pickles on top of SpecFlow, and it made what was a spreadsheet into a nice, pretty diagram that they could understand. We had all of our tests that they could see that way. And we had some search functionality over on the right side of the screen. They could get this through their browser, and they found this really useful. When they went through tests, they could manually test with this on their own desktops as they were going through.
Has anybody heard of Pickles? It's on GitHub. You can find it. It's a documentation generator. So like, you have all your unit tests or your tests running, your acceptance tests, and every time a commit goes through the build, this output is generated by Pickles. And you can, what we ended up doing anyway, was creating some kind of public-facing URL that allowed product owners, VAs, anybody who didn't have the build actually running on their local machine, go in and see what, in fact, was being tested at any given moment in time. It was a very useful, simple tool.
Yeah. Obviously, there was more detail behind it.
All right, so as like this, Jeffrey and Sam kind of explained how we got from our whiteboard sessions to these scenarios. So this, once the scenarios are in like these given when then sessions, product owners really started to get it. After that, they were actually really into the development process rather than just standing on the sideline and just watching us do our thing. They were into the team room every day. They would be writing new scenarios, stories before even come into play. They would be writing these tests and checking them in with the VAs and like ignored ones. So as over the time, we knew that we were going to get a ton of these. And once you have these scenarios, translating from the English language to the actual code and test is very expensive. And we had certain constraints in terms of our build times and things like that. So the approach we ended up going with is in-process acceptance test. So you guys understand like the difference between out-of-process acceptance test and or out-of-process testing and in-process testing?
I'm an analyst. I don't understand any of it.
All right. So like you guys have used Cucumber, and probably some of you guys have used SpecFlow. Here, if you are, let's say, monitoring a UI being rendered, let's say a browser, you have a process sitting outside and kind of just keep on monitoring what is the browser is rendering, and then based on the data that is on the screen, it's kind of asserts and shows you red or green. But instead of that, what we went with was in-process acceptance test, where we don't need our application to be deployed. Out-of-process acceptance tests are, most of the time flaky. As you guys have seen, if you have like AJAXy behaviors in your application, that tends to, promote these flakiness, and they are very slow. So these in-process acceptance tests kind of solve both of the problems here. As you can see, this code is in C#. That was the language that we were using over there. But as you can see, we are directly calling, injecting these controllers, which are our application objects, into our test, and we are directly calling the methods on it. These are the same URIs that you would hit from your browser, and it would return like sometimes JSON, sometimes some sort of view model HTML. But what you can do is in these tests, you can just get them, and then you can parse them out and compare to the table here that is provided by the spec flow scenarios. So what that did for us was that now they're 100% reliable. There is no flakiness. Of course, at this point, we are not testing that they are being rendered on the screen, but that wasn't the part important anyways. I mean, we wanted to make sure that all these calculations and math formulas are working for us. So yeah, the data itself. So that's the approach that helped us, and that kind of made sure that our build was faster or fast enough, and we were able to, even though we had more than 2,000 tests at one point, and we were able to actually run every single test on every single commit, and never had to switch into like nightly builds or to builds that run a couple times a day, things like that.
You mind if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Just a real quick point about a slide earlier about everyone's an engineer. So you can see that, if you've had experience doing test automation, typically you would hit something out of process. You would have some CSS selector or XPath, finding some element on the screen, asserting on whether it's there or what its text is or what its value is, etc. I had that experience prior to coming to this project, and without our sort of everyone's an engineer kind of thing, cross-pollination thing going on, I wouldn't have really gained the skill necessary to maintain 2,000 of these things. As you can see, there's no CSS selector here. This is, some understanding of MVC architecture, understanding like what controllers are, what their purpose is, understanding what controller actions are, things like that, and how to basically build up the data needed to pass through a controller action and then capture the response back from the server. I didn't really have that expertise as much as I do now, and that's really a result of us kind of throwing the normal expectations for roles out the window and cross-pollinate that knowledge with one another.
So yeah, as you can see, that they promoted faster feedback, faster than the normal standard acceptance test or UI test that you would see. Also, what happened was that these tests actually served also as an integration test. Since you can inject these tests at multiple levels, whether you are just like testing a specific service or a specific module or a specific repository, or in the example that we just showed, you're going all the way from the controller to the database, the repository, and coming back. And you can create these tab definitions for separate levels. So we were able to kind of use the English to test these different things, and that product owners liked it. And they really, because now they started to understand, and they started to care about the actual quality of the application. Of course, the biggest thing was that we never had to split our build. Keep saying that, but that was a big deal for us as a team.
Does anyone recognize this? Do you have a question?
Yes. I was just wondering, so you said you use these for the test that you've done. What if not building and all of them actually signing off on something about getting these tests to work?
I'm having a hard time hearing you actually.
So as a product owner,
yeah.
was the product owner sign off about these tests saying that yes, it seems to be really technical. And compared to the other tests that render something with UI, there, someone, product owner succeeded on the problem and say, well, this is what I'm seeing.
Okay, so the question I want to restate is that for the product owners, as they're looking at these tests, if I understand you're asking, how do they tell the difference between those tests that are hitting kind of like behind the browser and then when they're actually what they're seeing on the browser?
Could they just make sure that they were passing how it did? Yeah. I mean, I can take a stab at that. We had a continuous integration server running, so we would know at any moment, and technically the POs could know at any moment whether or not tests were failing. Now, that didn't necessarily happen. The team would figure that out and fix those tests. With regard to your question, the product owners were involved up front in assembling scenarios. And so for a feature to be finished, the tests had to be implemented and all going green. And so I think they would kind of check with the team, check with the BA, the analyst.
And Pickles
QA.
output would show you that those tests are, Pickles would actually show you. So once you actually commit your code and all the tests are green, for all of those output of all of those tests will be on the Pickles in like a formatted way. So product owners already kind of checked if that scenario or feature file, so they would go into that and actually see, all their tests are passing.
And also, it was, the feature was complete when they signed off. I think some teams maybe, when QA is complete, it's considered done. But for us, in this particular project, it wasn't considered done in each iteration until the product owner said it was done. And in fact, the product owners were the ones coming up with the most extreme, the most edge case type scenarios. So they would be using Pickles to determine that the ones they cared about the most were passing. Everyone know what this is?
Half a parallelogram.
Half. Yeah, it is. Like, is it? The test pyramid. So a basic concept. This is something, a concept developed by Mike Cohn in his book, Succeeding with Agile. And the basic message is that you want to have more low-level unit tests than high-level end-to-end functional or UI tests, because the ones up top that are hitting an out-of-process, client, I guess, whether it's running HTML, your WebDriver, your Firefox, or whatever, those are much more time-consuming. They cost a lot more, much more brittle, etc. And so this is kind of the classic accepted,
Didn't the pyramids go away with the Egyptians?
This one stayed.
thing. But we did something a little bit different, which is what Lav's going to.
Yeah, so for us, since our acceptance tests were, kind of the backbone of the way we were testing and developing our application, that layer kind of become fatter. And as you can see, the test pyramid ended up being like a test tent, I guess. So this was a little bit of a skewed version of a pyramid for us in our project. So these are some of the actual stats that we are showing here. So we were out there for more than a year, like 15, 16 months, I guess. Yeah, I guess so. So these are the number of tests that we had. And as you guys can see that, we had about 1,600 unit tests, which includes both JavaScript as well as unit tests for our code. We had about 1,250 acceptance tests and only 100 UI tests. And in normal, in any project, you would probably see 2 or 3 times more unit tests than acceptance tests. But in this case, it was a little bit skewed towards the acceptance test. And this is also the actual, stat in terms of our build times. We were using TeamCity as our integration tool, and as you guys can see, so ignore this code analysis part here. But we had these two builds, commit and functional test. Commit build was basically running all the tests that did not require application to be deployed. So that means that all the unit tests and all the acceptance tests. While the functional test was just
WebDriver.
Yeah, it was some WebDriver stuff that requires the application to be deployed. The main thing here that we want to focus on is on these ignore tests. I don't know how many guys can actually read this, but there are about 500 ignore tests on the commit and about 40 of those in functional. But they are quite different because those 543 commit tests, ignore tests, are actually tests that are developed or created by BAs and product owners or QAs for the features that aren't even implemented yet. So we were like that far ahead of the game. These product owners were so much interested in it that they would take up a story, they would create all these crazy scenarios and check it in, like all ignored ones. And as a dev, that was kind of spoiled us because we would pick up any story and we see all these scenarios already. We don't have to, worry about kind of reading or trying to come up with our own. They were already there, so we implement the feature, we refactor, make them pass. But these functional tests are actually the flaky ones. These are, all you guys have seen those kind of issues. Sam, if you want to jump in here, the Selenium test.
I want to jump in on the 543. Commented or ignore tests. When we're talking about building customers that care, they really got into this in the end because we cared about what they were saying. We showed that we wanted to understand their domain, that we wanted to document their domain, and we wanted to have tests that proved that this program would solve their problems, that this would really help them, revolutionize the way they wanted to. The fact that we could do those tests gave them a new appreciation for the team, because they would develop the tests, and 2 weeks later, when the developer or developer pair picked them up, they'd say, hey, you've got these 4 tests for this piece of functionality. Let's just walk through it and make sure I understand. So there's a lot of interaction with everyone on the team, including the developers and the product owners. So the product owners we're not just dealing with me as an analyst or Sam who's confirming that there's a problem here in the program, but with the developers saying, let's have our own whiteboard session. I want to walk through this one more time. And what about what you said last week? Because I thought the rounding was different, or whatever the case was. These ignored tests became a focal part of the communication between us and helped show the customers that we cared. And when they saw we cared, they cared more.
Quick question, yeah?
So, when you said the tests, you're talking about in the spec flow, you're rewriting people within scenarios of spec flow.
Yeah, the question is, are we talking about scenarios in spec flow? And the answer is yes.
So, we're the people who are kind of taking this upon themselves, are they beginning to learn to reuse, like were they doing it in Visual Studio with tooling to see the syntax and know that this given has already been used, so I can reuse it?
The question's about reuse and how are we doing that. There's a whole lot of reuse. Why don't you show it?
Yeah, Pickles was the tool. That's how initially we kind of had to hand hold them and kind of babysit them in those terms. But once they figured it out how to get to the Pickles output, see what are already steps that are implemented. Sometimes since the features are not implemented, those steps aren't there. So they would come and ask either us or them that hey guys, I'm trying to create the scenario, but I don't see any step. So we would just ask them to create one step definition, and when we are actually implementing it as a part of development, you would either change it a little bit or implement it exactly the way they said it.
One other point to make too about the ignored tests being checked in ahead of time. Again, I keep harping on this cross-pollination idea, but from time to time we had, I think it was standard practice for all the testers to be proficient in version control, specifically Git, so that we could check code in and out and do things like that, and that's pretty standard. But a couple of our BAs got to be proficient in version control, so it made it so much more seamless, the notion of getting this stuff in ahead of the development cycle without having to interrupt developers or do things like that. It was people taking things that typically might belong to a person with a dev title and kind of like assuming that skill set and then helping the team move faster.
Usually I like working with dev, but there were a couple of you guys that were a pain in my tuchus.
Very nice. Next slide.
Okay, so this is a little bit about our bug cycle. We talked about story cycle, we talked about some of the major bugs that happened in the previous attempt at this project. We wanted to have a way to document issues, and this approach, these specs allowed us to do that. I would just say that as the project grew in complexity as time went on, it became impossible to walk up to Jeffrey with like human words and describe to him a problem. It was just like there were so many numbers, it was so much data, and you're like having to look through like Excel sheets of data. It was virtually impossible. So we got to the point as a team where if you wanted to communicate a problem, you would communicate through a broken test. And so you find some issue, and the product owner finds some issue, and we'll kind of start there. They'll find the issue, confirm that this is actually something that goes against our understanding or goes against how the machine should function. And they would pair QA pairing, BA pairing, PO pairing, etc. Getting that thing hashed out into a spec flow spec into the system and ignored, so that I didn't have to walk over to Lav and explain to him in English, what the problem was. Doing good?
And because we were talking about a domain that hadn't been documented, it was living in their heads and in the existing program that was, a couple decades old. Because of that, they weren't always certain of things. There were times that when we're saying, hey, this doesn't work the way I think it does. Well, it works just like your peer said last week. So between, Frank and Sam, Frank said this is the way it works. A week later, Sam's testing, and Sam goes, this isn't how it works. So these tests that are really good conversations, occasionally bring in, Bob, the boss, to actually settle the conversation between Frank and Sam about what was supposed to be going on. So to say that they were all bugs is actually a gross overstatement. They weren't. This was living documentation that we're building and growing. What was a test would become the new standard. that new standard might have come because something was broken, we made a mistake, let's go back to rounding again, or because they said something to us wrong and they really didn't understand what the difference was. So that was an important part of it.
Yeah, red flags definitely went off when we found any issue with rounding, and so all of that is kind of documented now for them. A good thing, being able to get bitten by that.
So once the tests were kind of checked in and ignored, whenever the player has a chance to pick them up, we would fix the bug or refactor and stuff, and that way the bug is killed. But the point here is that made every single bug documented in our repository and checked in with our code base. And as if someone take the old scenario and kind of add another step to it, or add a little bit more complexity to it, we had different versions of it too. So that was really helpful.
It's a personal thing for me, but I get really annoyed that defects aren't work like work is work. Defects are something else. Bugs are something else. I mean, and most teams I'm on, the truth is that developers just consider it more work. It's another story to do. And since we were using this way, since they became the actual tests, they became the living documentation, it was work. It was just the next iteration of our understanding as our domain language or domain understanding of the group. So we've got a few slides here where we talk about the future. If we could go back in time or the next time we implement a project like this. The first one, I see to my peers, the Analyst, and to all the people who are out there talking directly to the product owners and to the subject matter experts, don't be afraid. We were afraid of these conversations. We weren't certain how they were going to go. They had expressed some resistance. We were doing it in part because there was the voice of the CIO was sitting on the project and would show up twice a week and throw some disruptive comment. In order to calm him down, we said, okay, let's pursue this a little bit more. It was a great thing. As an example, I used to explain how to do Scrum and Agile to business analysts, waterfall business analysts. And when you first introduce Agile to them, they're afraid they're going to lose their job because they don't get it. When we first started this, we didn't get it. It turns out the other side of that chasm is much better than where you are today. You really want to be talking in scenarios. You want to get the whole team on the same page. The domain understanding is huge, and we for a drastically different project. Next is, we can't say enough about whiteboards. Put them everywhere. We had one of the team rooms, so we moved around a number of times, had a wall of windows. And the best days were when it was gray outside, so we could write all over the windows and see what we were talking about. Whiteboards were great. I would regularly walk into an office for one of the product owners with 2 developers. And I'd say, can I erase the whiteboard, or do you want to take a picture first? Because I'm definitely going to erase it. The only question is, do you want to copy it? And then we would use that to talk about what the scenarios were. Whiteboard conversations are really key, and they were the basis for all of my understanding.
Yeah, remember your unit tests. So as we have explained how these acceptance tests were awesome, but we want us to make sure that they are not meant to replace the unit test. Unit test is kind of serves as a tool that promotes refactoring. If you take your code as an API, your unit test is your first client, which is kind of tapping into that API and helps you refactor that. If you have a code or method which is 10 lines long and your test is 50 lines long, or you are doing too much mocking that kind of tells you that there's something wrong with the code. So just making sure that the message is not that acceptance tests are taking place of unit tests; they are just kind of complementing them.
And finally, empowering the product owners. We could have done this more. Throughout the course of the project, they became more engaged. They became more engaged in how we were testing the product. They wanted to know, they were helping us drive out these edge case scenarios, complex things. We would have liked to have given them even, I guess, increased ability to do this. And I'm actually kind of looking to you folks to give me any ideas you may have, but if we could have given them some kind of like public-facing form to input these scenarios that they can pull from Pickles, and then submit that form and have it basically build up an ignored spec and spec flow, that would have been kind of like the ultimate. We never really got to that point. There had to be a handoff of some kind, whether it was to a technical BA or to a QA or to a dev from the product owner. But if we could have made their interaction even more seamless with the test code base, would have been would have been better.
Yeah, we wanted them to just kind of, write a quick scenario and without deploying the application on their machine or anything like that, just want to quickly test it. Just didn't get a chance to explore that much.
And thank you for your attention. I think we have time for a question or two, is that right? He says yes. Okay, from the back. Talk loud.
Yes, so like our UI tests, like we showed, they were the out process. They were the one, Selenium test, kind of looking at the browser and querying the CSS selectors and making sure that they're being rendered. But we just had like very happy paths, smoke test, and sort of like we were testing some permissions and things like that when certain user logs in, certain link shows up. It was pretty limited because we were able to achieve a lot of things in the process.
A question up here.
So at the end of the project, was Pickles the documentation, or did somebody create comprehensive documentation from Pickles that, was used for people at a higher level or something?
In fact, the project is still ongoing. We personally are no longer there. So Pickles was really a way to sort of bridge the gap between the code base and people who didn't have the build running on their machine. The actual documentation is the test. We had new devs come on from Brazil, new teams come on and work with us, etc. And really, like the living documentation is the spec flow tests themselves. That's why that's what we would definitely recommend versus Pickles, which is a snapshot, but the tests are the documentation.
In the back.
One of the things that I struggle with is when you have acceptance tests and unit tests that both testing the same thing. So what was your approach? What was your approach to that when you had acceptance tests that tested something and maybe it might have tested just one component, but you also had unit tests for that tested basically the same scenarios? Get rid of one of these?
Yeah, in those scenarios we were doing the acceptance test. Focus was if there's just, you are testing one component, has to be done with unit tests. We were pretty strict on TDD, so most of the tests were already there. So once I would say acceptance tests are more we had modularized approach to our application, and so we had some services sitting there, and of course our controllers, which is doing the MVC request response. So those were the major things that we kind of tested through our acceptance tests.
I would just add that as testers, we were looking to be responsible for not only the acceptance test layer, but the unit test layer. So there were times when we would find, say, like a shortest path algorithm that we had, widely covered by unit tests, wasn't really a need to have it covered by acceptance tests as much. And so we would try to negotiate the two.
It's funny because we take the opposite approach. So we would favor acceptance tests over unit tests, and if unit tests maybe we go with unit tests.
We had a few developers actually doing that. The problem that we saw a little bit was that whenever there was like an issue, since acceptance tests are covering bigger kind of coverage, it was hard to pinpoint that this is the component that's failing. So the feedback was still a little bit slower than the unit test.
I think there's another question toward the front.
Yeah. You very quickly talked about living documentation, which goes back to Spec by Example book. I was wondering, we had discussed it in our current project. First of all, if you want to create living documentation, you have to make sure that most of the tests are in fact positive, because if I'm coming in to the project from the outside and I see a ton of negative tests, I don't really get what the system's supposed to do. So I was going to ask whether you did that. And secondly, did you achieve living documentation? Were the QX or SpecFlow, were they actually the documentation for the project?
We had client developers who had, I guess, tasks meant for them outside of the project where they were documenting things as they went along. But I would say yes, the tests were the documentation for the project. And when we roll off, it was that case.
Yeah, that's how we transition it to the new devs.
Yeah, exactly. When new people came on, we would direct them to the test. They say, "How does this work?" It's like I could explain to you how this works, but it's going to be much more inefficient than you going and looking at the test. That's what they're for. And if you don't want to read the code behind the test, the reason we have this BDD framework with nice English on top is that you can read it and know what is happening, know how it works.
Yeah. As living documentation goes, and as a business analyst for a decade, I was shocked at how well it worked. I really couldn't have expected any more from it, and it beat all the expectations I had going.
And how
Worked
did
really well,
you?
and the business was happy.
And did you separate between negative and positive tests, not to confuse the
We
user?
focused primarily on the positive tests. There were some negative tests. We didn't do much separation between them that I recall.
No, I don't either. I would say, I'm just trying to think back to like everything that we tested, which was a lot of different things, but I would say we're telling how the system should function, much more so than we were saying how it shouldn't function. I can't think of an example where we were saying how it shouldn't function, unless maybe it was like a speck around a bug or something like that.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, was there a case where you had to do manual testing?
Yes.
Where was that?
So one of the things that we actually didn't mention up front is that because this is a natural gas pipeline, it is federally regulated by an entity called NASB. And NASB dictates literally what you show on the screen, colors of elements, position of elements, words that you use. So there's definitely a manual exploratory testing component. We had some JavaScript components, things happening on the UI that we needed to manually test. So yeah, that was definitely there. With regard to the acceptance test stuff, there were just a lot of these calculations that we talked about, the algorithms that are like looking at the capacity of the pipe at any mile marker and determining what's going to come out or what's going to flow past. That was all kind of done under the UI because it didn't really matter, with regard to the UI, what numbers were there in those elements. But the fact that the elements were in a particular spot or that they had a particular label was important, and we kind of had to go approach that with a manual testing, or at least Selenium testing.
The product owners certainly did manual testing. I mean, they would write up these scenarios and we would input them. But when they went through for their testing, after we'd already passed it, they would then enter the scenarios that they'd given us, and then they'd enter more scenarios. One of the things we discovered is when we first started this, they would give us the simplest scenario possible. And then, we're done coding, we passed the test, they would run 9 scenarios, of which what they gave us was only 1. So it took time for them to understand, give us all 9, or give us the most complicated of those 9. Let's talk about why you're going to do 9 manually, and then let's make sure we incorporate what's valuable out of that into our testing.
We didn't get away without doing manual testing, and everyone was doing that. I think I mentioned that earlier, but that was still a component. It wasn't like it wasn't required. It was definitely still there.
Yeah, we were also trying to hack a few things since the security issues and things like that. I think people were trying to just manipulate the HTML and JavaScript stuff and see if they can access the resource that you are not supposed to. Things like that, yes, that was happening all the time as well.
There was a concern for that. We were doing a lot of things like OWASP type stuff, cross-site scripting, HTML injection, things like that, because there is a concern being what they do, etc. It's like a.
Okay, we're over time, so thank you very much. If you have any questions, we'll be around. I don't want to take away your break time.
Thanks.